online. If you don't know who I am, my name is Matt Manning, and I'm joined up here today with Jeff Tompkins, and he soon will be voted on by you as maybe our next moderator here at Crossroads Church. I'll explain what all of that looks like today, but I want to say thank you for joining us online today. I know that this is still not normal. It doesn't feel right, but we are doing what we can as we make it through this COVID season. So I want to thank you for taking the time to join us online today as we work through the business stuff that we have for Crossroads Church today. Today we have a big day, a big agenda, and so we are going to take a vote on the budget, and I'll kind of explain, Jeff and I will explain what's going on with the budget and where that is going over the course of this next year. You'll also get a chance to hear a little bit from Jeff about who he is and get a chance to vote on him as well as our moderator, or the next moderator here at Crossroads Church. And we are going to actually begin with starting with the wrapping up of our strategic planning process that we've been on since really November, where we brought in consultants and walked through that together as a church and as a staff. And so that's where we're actually going to begin today. And so I'm going to take about 40 minutes to present that all to you. We'll have various times where we will answer your questions. Pastor James, Chip, Michelle are all online to be able to help answer questions. We'll also be paying attention to the chat room to answer any of your questions, but there will be specific times where I'll be able to answer those for you, and then we'll move into Jeff as moderator and the budget together, all right? And so as we begin in today, really talking about the strategic planning process, what I just want to ask you to do is actually just to dream big. I want you to dream big today and to really kind of just lean into what God has shown us. And by the way of starting here, what I want to do is really just share a story with you, a story really of two churches. And the story begins really with this unintended shift that almost 60 years ago, a small church started in the outskirts of an ever-expanding American city. A group of faithful men and women wanted to establish a church where people moving into this area could thrive, discover Jesus, and grow in a lifestyle of knowing him. These courageous church planters loved Jesus, and they wanted the young families of this new area moving into there to meet him and to find the same hope that they had found in Jesus. As decades passed, this church grew and blossomed alongside the city. As farms and pastures turned into neighborhoods and eventually suburbs, many people found a connection to Jesus through this emerging congregation. It was an exciting time as God did amazing work with those who were finding hope in Jesus. The churches, or as the city continued to grow, so did the church, but not in a way that it had in the past. Something had changed, something significantly had changed. Unintentionally, the church stopped attracting as many new people as they had in the past who were unfamiliar with Jesus, and instead what began to happen was that they were starting to attract people who were simply familiar with Jesus, people from other churches. And the churches in which these people came from, they were not bad churches or getting away from the Bible or ignoring the needs of the community. Some of them had simply closed. And for others, this established church had better programs and higher energy things going on that was created by exceptional and talented staff. And as these transfers settled in, they felt at home. Honestly, the church didn't even realize that this was going on. The church continued to grow, it continued to thrive, collecting more and more people from other congregations. Hundreds of people from other congregations even took advantage of the church's programs in their buildings, but remained with their old congregations who could not or would not provide these resources for them. The reach of this church to those not connected to Jesus changed as well. They served the community more than ever before and faithfully supplied the many, many needs of the people in their community. And while the recipients of these resources were grateful, they seemed to show no interest in investigating or connecting within this church. The church became a resource with very little spiritual activity and connection with the larger community. And though this became the norm, no one seemed to notice within the church that they were no longer connecting with those who were far from Jesus. They were busy, extremely busy, and they just assumed that the fruit from all of their labor and their many activities was happening. Though their service and generosity, this big-hearted congregation even gained the respect of community leaders. They became known as the serving church in their city. They put on huge events, showed radical generosity to the community, and met many tangible needs. Even with that reputation, the community had no relational ties to this church. And while they had done a spectacular job of serving others, very few of the beneficiaries were actually connecting with Jesus. Now, I probably don't need to say this. This probably is obvious, but this is the story of our church. This is our history as Crossroads Church. And as we've walked through this strategic process with the consultants, we've learned a few things about who we are and our past. None of it bad, but just things that we've learned. And so today what I want to do is just take a moment to share some of the learnings, some of the things that we've discovered about our church, the DNA, and how we can ultimately turn the corner as a church. That one of the things that we learned initially is that for the last 49 of our 58 years of existence, that we have seen steady growth here at Crossroads Church. And because of that steady growth, this has led to a misguided optimism that has kept us from asking the really hard questions. That the last 9 years, as probably most of you who are attending this business meeting know, that we've seen a decline in our attendance. And every year, as a staff, as a body, we just believed that the next year was going to be better, that the next year was the year that we were going to turn the corner. And that kind of optimism kept us from asking the hard questions. Another thing that we learned is that for most of our history, that our growth has been attributed to church transfers, people looking for effective programs and high energy events. That one of the real moments this moment that became real to me is at our last business meeting in January where we were all together, if you can remember that. There was about 200 of us in the room. Jeff, you were there? I was. And I asked the question, how many of you came from another church? And all but a few hands were raised. That's the history of our church. In fact, as we look through the history of our church, that we can see that some of the most robust times of our growth were when other churches in our community closed. Another thing that we learned is that we're a very complex church with many activities, but we seem to primarily meet the needs of people who have been following Jesus for a long time. In one way that you could put it is that we are a church that church people love to attend. In fact, many other churches send their people to us for needs that they no longer value or even want to provide. That this became real to me in November. I was sitting at our North Glen campus, actually, and as I was sitting there, I was talking to Kristen Brown, the receptionist and front office desk, and she was working, and the phone rang, and she answered it, and then almost immediately the phone rang again, so I went ahead and I picked it up, and on the other end of the line was this young lady, and she had a friend who had just recently passed away, and they were looking to do a funeral. And her friend had attended this large church in this community. And as they went to that large church to ask to do the funeral service, they were politely told that that's not something this church does. And they were actually handed a list of churches who do funerals really well, like a Yelp list of churches who do great funerals. And at the top of that list was Crossroads Church. Now, let me tell you, while I am grateful that we are known for doing great funerals and for meeting people in that need of their life, there is not a single person a part of Crossroads Church who wants to be known as the funeral church, right? I mean, that is like death. And so, but that was the reality. In fact, we even know of some churches in our area who no longer do VBS, but instead take our flyers and print them and give them to their people saying, this is the church that you can go to do that. Some other things that we learned is that while we have faithfully served our community and supplied a lot of tangible services, those efforts have not led to reaching and connecting with the unchurched. That we're known in the community as the serving church. However, even with all of our effort and all of the use of resources, that we've seen very little actual fruit of serving people towards Jesus. As we sat back and learned about that, the only emotion that maybe we could say is it was frustrating. That is a frustrating reality. All the data that we've collected tells us that our current primary reach is to empty nesters and to middle-aged family who are familiar with God and the church. When we looked out at our campuses and our church, we saw that, and we said, you know what, that's painfully accurate. Internally as a church, we are growing older and less diverse, while our communities have actually grown younger and more diverse. And that divide between who we are as a church and what our community is growing every year. that we haven't pushed ourselves to think through and to see ourselves through the eyes of the unchurched and the spiritually alienated. So obviously, as I talk through the things that we've learned, we don't want to stay there. We can't stay here as a church. And so most of our strategic partner working with our consultants was going, this is who we are. This is the reality of where we're at. How do we move into the future? What is God calling us to? What does the DNA of Crossroads look like into the future? What is the better picture that we can run towards? And so I want to share that with you. See, I believe that we can be a church of people who know how to be enthusiastic friends and connect with those in our neighborhoods, our workplaces, our social circles, with our families, people whose friends are thankful for us because of our compassion, our care, and our grace for them. That our neighbors know that we are Christians, but they're also intrigued by how much we care about the stories of their lives, whatever that looks like. That we invite our pre-Christian friends into the messiness of our own lives so they see how Jesus is empowering and active in real life and calling us to give our lives to him as our Savior. Now, we're going to do this by learning together how to live differently, by intentionally living our faith in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces, in our schools, and becoming, through personal relationships, a bridge for people to come and to know and to love Jesus. That as a church, the activities we spend our time and resources on will have the direct goal of lovingly and connecting people to Jesus and the life of the church. The church is not something that we do, but rather it is who we are. And we lovingly invite people we care about into a warm and accepting space. Now, as we go through this, we will do this by rethinking community engagement towards greater success of cultivating relationships and leading people to Jesus. The events that we host will be intentionally built to empower our people, Crossroads people, to engage relationally with those in the community, to invite their friends, their families, and their neighbors to our church. That we can be, I believe, a church with a presence in the digital world that is inviting, hopeful, and fun. Now, all of us over the course of the last several months in this COVID season have realized how impersonal at times the digital world can be. Our goal is to be wildly creative towards connecting with people and creating a desire for them to know more about our church and the God who loves them a lot. At the end of the day, we want to go where people are, and almost every single person that we know is living in the digital world, particularly right now. So we have a goal of doing this by investing time, energy, and resources more than we ever have in our entire history of Crossroads in engaging people in the digital realm as a true front door to Crossroads Church. We believe that we can be a church that when we gather, something special happens. It doesn't feel religious with insider language or assumptions, but there's an excitement, a hope, and a tangible experience that God is really among us. That we'll use language and music of our worlds. And what happens in those moments is transcendence. The experience is mysterious beyond this world, but there's something that pulls within all of us, that causes our hearts to long for more. That we will do this as a church by creating worship gatherings that honor God, feeds the needs of believers, and makes the experience accessible for those who are unfamiliar with Jesus. Showing them that God is good and that the church that he calls us to be a part of is meaningful. We believe that we can be a church where there is a clear invitation to life change. That it doesn't matter where you come from or how much you know or even how much you don't know. That there's a simple path to connecting with others, growing in love, responding to Jesus in ways that are deeply satisfying to our soul. We see men, women, couples, singles, teenagers, and children all invited to know Jesus and discover that he has prepared for them an adventure of living. And growth here will not be measured in levels of knowledge or even busyness, but in the depths of our love and care for one another. That we will learn so that we can love people better. That there's a palpable invitation to live in community. And we'll do this by building clear paths for people from all ages to grow in their faith. that will encourage families and individuals to cultivate a biblical lifestyle within the church and the community in which they live. Finally, we believe that we can be a church where people are cared for, primarily by each other as we simply learn how to love as the Holy Spirit empowers us. And rather than a hierarchy of pastoral authority, the church excels in its people simply caring for one another. This will be seen in creative ways that people in community groups look out for one another, as well as with a sea of faithful, joyful volunteers, visiting people in hospitals, sitting with them in their pain, in the joys and the sorrows of life, and walking with each other through emotional, physical, and spiritual struggles of life. That I believe that we can be a light in a dark world that deeply needs Jesus but has no idea how to experience him. That we will do this by embracing a vision of care, where individuals minister to each other within community, and believers simply care for the body of Christ and those who are connecting in new and beautiful ways. That's what I believe Crossroads can all be all about. Not a church that's living in the legacy of our past, but rather a church that looks towards the future of what God's calling us to in terms of the DNA that we can be as we live out a brand new vision that God has given to us. And so with the story of those two churches, I know every single person is asking, well, what does that look like? How do we do that? And so what we're going to put on the screen for you actually is a couple of slides for you to see and for us to walk through. And the first slide that I'm going to put up is what we call our Vision 2025 slide. That all of this story that I just shared, this DNA of who Crossroads is going to become, is simply put in a vision statement like this. That we believe that God is positioning Crossroads Church to serve people toward and connect people to Jesus by expanding our kingdom impact in our communities and beyond, by being a multi-ethnic, multi-generational church focused on making disciples of the next generation, our kids and our grandkids. That when I think of that vision, that there's something inside of me that just gets excited for it. And as we've thought about that vision through our strategic planning process, we put 5 goals around what would it look like for us to actually accomplish this vision? What would we need to do? And so what you see in the green on the slides there in front of you is our goals that we're moving towards. The first goal that we have is to lead 1,500 people to salvation, freedom, and the going public of their faith through baptism. Now, let me be honest with you. When I see this first one, there is just this optimism, this irrational optimism that drives me here, that we have no business putting this number down. We haven't seen 1,500 people baptized in the last 10 years, but we're going to do it in the next 5. That I'm just praying that God leads us in that way, that we see that many people come to Jesus in these next 5 years. The second part of the slide there is mobilizing 4D. I guess the first part there is mobilizing people to live in 4D. That every person in our church, we want to inspire to live in 4D. So that 5,000 of our neighbors, coworkers, and friends visit a Crossroads service, whether that be online or in our own homes. What is 4D, you might ask? Well, 4D is what we just talked about in our series, Being the Church, where we are determined to serve our neighborhoods, our coworkers, our family, those who are far away from Jesus. Where we come in and we develop friendship with them, where we discover their stories, and ultimately as people that we display the gospel in our lives. That we want to mobilize every single person, inspire every single person at Crossroads to live 4D. The next thing that you see on there is engage. That we want to engage 10,000 people weekly through live streams, podcasts, and other forms of digital content. That as we wrote this down and walked through this early in the year, we had no idea what was coming with the COVID-19 season. Like no idea at all. And the reality is the church that we knew in January is not the church that we're going to know this next January. That the world has moved quickly into the digital realm. That crisis is not only a disruptor, but it's also an accelerator. And in our culture, the digital means and the digital connection is the way that almost all of our world connects and moves and gets information. And the church has been a little bit slow in adopting that. And so we're going to, along with everything else in culture, hit the accelerator on this and seek to engage 10,000 people weekly through our digital means. The fourth thing that you see on this slide is to connect. That we have a goal of connecting every single person who calls Crossroads home to a discipleship path that includes Bible teaching, worship, serving others, authentic community, and to embrace developing authentic relationships with people that God puts in our lives whom we can share our faith in Jesus with. That we want everybody engaged in that kind of community. So much so that when it comes to the way that we look at our church, that we're no longer publishing attendance numbers. Because for a long time, it's been known in church world that attendance does not equate to spiritual growth, that attendance is not the lead measure in spiritual growth, but rather engagement is. And so we want to create just a vibrant discipleship path for people to engage in, and then to measure those numbers of spiritual growth, because we're not just in the business of having big gatherings, that we're in the business of discipling people through engaging them with Jesus. Finally, the last thing there is to launch, that we want to launch 2 new churches in our region through our residency program. That last year we asked Pastor Kim to begin a residency program here at Crossroads Church where we would take people who are coming into their last days of seminary to bring them into the church and to train them. And God has given us a vision to use them to launch new churches in our region for His glory. And so as you look at that, that's the vision. And so you hear the story and the DNA of where we want to go. You see the visions and the goals of where we're going. And the question then becomes, well, how do we get there? How do we see these goals begin to happen? And so I want to introduce you to something that we've been working on throughout our strategic process planning called the pyramid. And the pyramid really is a function of how we're going to get there. And so, Tim, if you want to go ahead and pull this up, and we'll just leave this up here for a while as I walk through this, that this pyramid has really 3 pieces to it. And this is the how of this vision becoming real. That you see on the left side there is the foundation, the directional, and the action. That's how this pyramid is separated. Now, when you think about this, the foundation are things that never change. That this is true to who we are, who we've always been, and who we will always be. When it comes to direction are things that need to change every 3 to 5 years. And then finally, you have the action, and the action changes maybe monthly, at times weekly, or even daily. And so walking through this pyramid, at the very bottom, the very foundation of Crossroads Church is what we call our core beliefs. It's what we believe about Jesus. It's what we believe about salvation. It's what we believe about the Father and the Holy Spirit and how we live out our lives. Now, these core beliefs, they never change. In fact, when we rewrote the Constitution in 2014, we so believe that these core values should not change that we actually put them in the Constitution, and the only way that they can change is by a church vote. That's how serious we are about our core beliefs. These things never change. It's what we believe about God and the church and the ways of salvation. Now, moving up the pyramid there, the next thing that you see is mission. And the mission for the church never changed. And the reason the mission never changes is because every church has the same mission. Now, we may say it a little bit different, but every church has the same mission. And we find it in Matthew chapter 28, where Jesus says, "Go therefore and make disciples of every nation, baptizing them in my name and teaching them all the things that I have commanded of you." That's the mission of every church. The way we say it here at Crossroads Church is to serve people toward and connect people to Jesus. That's what our mission as a church is. And while we may update the language, the mission remains the same because the mission is out of the Bible. That's never going to change. Going up to the 3rd level on our pyramid here, you see the words making disciples. And when it comes to making disciples, again, this doesn't change. And the reason it doesn't change is, again, because we find it in the Bible. That when we open the scriptures, we see that disciples of Jesus are engaging the scriptures. They're others focused. They're making disciples. They're worshiping God. They're empowered to live out their purpose. That's what a disciple is. And we get those things right from the Bible. And so as you look at Crossroads Church, the church that we all love, that these things aren't changing. Our core beliefs aren't changing. Our mission's not changing. The way that we see disciples are not changing. So then we move to that second level of direction. And like I said earlier, direction changes every 3 to 5 years. That vision that we spoke of, that we believe that God is calling us to live out our mission of serving people toward and connecting people to Jesus, that the way that he's calling us to live that out is in our vision by expanding our kingdom impact in our communities and beyond, by being a multi-ethnic, multi-generational church focused on making disciples of the next generation, our kids and our grandkids. That changes every 3 to 5 years, that this is our focus for the next 5 years. And once we have our vision, then we move up the chart to organizational goals. And the question becomes, well, how do we live out this vision? What does that look like? And so the vision that we have is seen in the goals that I just shared, the 1,500 baptisms, the 10,000 people in digital engagement, the mobilizing our church to reach 5,000 of their neighbors, and so on. That's the goals. And then the goals turn into strategies. And the way that we've begun to reorganize our church is around 5 key strategies: outreach, innovation, weekend services, engagement, and care. That we're forming strategies to meet those goals so that ultimately we can live out the vision that God has given to us. That's the directional space. Then you get to the top, which is action. And at the next level there is what you see is ministry priorities. And what those ministry priorities are the ministries that we do here at Crossroads Church. Things like children's and students, adult groups, prayer, go serve, missions, etc. That those are the things, the priorities. And the way that this all works is that every ministry priority then looks at the strategies that we have in place, the goals that we're aiming for in the vision, and each ministry priority goes, how do we help carry out the vision of this church so that we can make disciples and live out the mission that God's given to us? That's the mission priorities. And then finally, the very top of the pyramid is personal priorities. How do I contribute to this? How does Matt Manning contribute to this? How does Jeff Tompkins contribute to this? How does Terry Kettleson contribute to this? How do people within the congregation contribute to this? How do I do that? And the simple answer right now, like I said at the beginning, is I just want to ask you to dream big. I just want you to pray and to digest everything that we're walking through today in such a way that you would look at this and go, God, like I see this vision. I'm excited for what you're doing at the church. And then for you to begin to ask the question, how do I engage? What does it look like for you to engage in relationships with your neighbor, living out the 4D lifestyle? What does it look like for you to begin to be open to having conversations that ultimately changes people's lives because you share your faith with them and they accept Jesus? What does it look like for not me to be baptizing one of your neighbors, but because you led your neighbor to Jesus, that you're in the tub baptizing that person? How do you contribute to this vision? You begin to look at the strategies, the goals, and the vision and go, how can I participate in that? And when we're all doing that collectively as a church, then the vision becomes real, and we start living this out together. Now, obviously, as we put all of this together, one of the questions that then started to rise up is if we're actually going to do this, that we're going to have to reorganize the church, that we're going to have to reorganize some of the ministries that we're a part of. We're going to have to reorganize the staff, that we're going to have to rethink the way that we do church. See, for the last 15, 20 years of church, we've been a multi-site church. And a multi-site church is simply a church that has multiple churches that are kind of doing their own thing, living out their own spaces. And as we thought about that, and as we've walked down that road of multi-site church, we said if we were to really live out this vision, no longer can we think in multi-site ways, but rather we have to start thinking as one church with multiple venues, one church with multiple venues. Where when it comes to this idea of one church at multiple venues, think of like children's ministry. No longer are we thinking in terms of North Glen has its own children's ministry and Thornton has its children's ministry and then Fort Lupton has its children's ministry, but rather we have a Crossroads children's ministry working in sync, living this vision out. If you're an adult, Think of it in terms of community groups. No longer do we have like Thornton community groups and North Glen community groups and Fort Lupton community groups. Rather, we have one person overseeing all community groups for Crossroads Church. That's the way that we've started to think about reorganizing. And so we want to share with you today the way that we're reorganizing our staff in order to achieve this vision that God has given to us as a church. And so the slide that's going to come up here is our staff reorganized. You can go ahead and pull that up, Tim. At the top, hopefully this is no surprise to you, but I'm the senior pastor here and will remain in that role as we live this out. And when it comes to the senior pastor in churches that are growing, that senior pastors spend about 80% of their time doing 4 specific things. And so I just want to share with those today. One of those things, or the first one of those things, is focusing on vision. Focusing on vision. What I'm doing today, sharing vision with you, leading groups of people through vision, reminding our staff of what our vision is, and keeping those 5 priorities as a goal of where we're going and what we're doing. That's vision. That I'm also called, as the senior pastor, to spend my time on leading leaders. That I'm the leader of leaders here at Crossroads Church, first with staff and then with our high-level leadership like church council and the trustees, that I'm a leader of leaders here at Crossroads Church. That I spend my time also as the champion of our culture. That every church has a unique culture. Crossroads is no different. That we have a culture that speaks to our values, where we are generous, where we serve, where we're all about Jesus, where we treat the Bible like we believe it. But even lower than that, there's also other cultural things that make us up. And I'm ultimately the guardian of that culture here at Crossroads Church. The fourth focus of a senior pastor is that of teaching. Just so you're aware that anytime Pastor Chris or Pastor Tim or myself is teaching, that typically we spend somewhere between 50 and 60% of our week preparing for those messages, that we take it serious, that we want to make sure that teaching has happened. Well, ultimately, I'll be teaching a majority of the time, and when I'm not, I'm overseeing those other 2 guys in terms of what they're teaching, developing, and all of the rest. And so for churches that are growing, for churches that are thriving, the senior pastor spends about 80% of their time on those 4 things: vision, leader of leaders, culture champion, and teaching. Now, under me is the role of executive here at Crossroads Church. And I've asked Angie Duran to serve as our executive here at Crossroads Church. If you don't know Angie is a great woman of faith here at Crossroads Church. She started with us in our children's ministry at Fort Lupton, rose up in terms of taking over for Laura Brazaghini and leading all of our children's ministry here at Crossroads Church. And these last few months, I've asked her to step into a brand new role of leading as an executive of Crossroads Church. That Angie is number 2 here at Crossroads Church. And her role is really to see vision to execution, that she takes the vision that we're doing and she goes, how do we execute this on a daily level? She's also in charge of the high impact teams. That the people that you see here and the way that we have this organized are teams as well as volunteers, and she wants to make sure that our teams are high impact. And then finally, where she's leading us is really in helping us accomplish the vision and the goals that we have by doing what we would call 90-day sprints, where we'll take a few things and go, for the next 90 days, we're going to focus on this as we aim towards the vision. That is Angie's role in this space. In very many ways, it's the role that I played under Pastor Kim all of these years. Now, there might be a couple of questions when it comes to Angie, and I just want to address those questions right now. Maybe the first question that you have is Angie actually suited for this role? And I just want to tell you, yes, she is. That a little bit of Angie's story is that in college, she went to CU, and once upon graduating out of CU, she went to work for a local manufacturing company here at Crossroads Church. And within 5 years, she went from just starting at this company to actually becoming the VP of sales and marketing for this company. In her time there, for 10 years, she served in that role, overseeing $50 million in profits, 40 staff people. She was incredibly successful in that role. In 2012, she had this moment with God where God was speaking to her that she needed to take a Sabbath. And she actually walked away from that entire job to focus on being a mom and being a wife and focusing on her relationship with Jesus. During that time, she got involved here at Crossroads Church as a volunteer on Saturday nights, and within a year after that, we actually hired her to take on the children's role up at our Fort Lupton campus. Under her role, under her leadership there at Fort Lupton, our children's ministry flourished. And when Laura Brazzagini, 2.5 years ago, decided that it was time to retire and to move on to other things in her life, it was Angie who Laura handpicked to take on the role that she had served. Angie stepped into that role, leading our children's ministry. We also added to her our youth ministry. And over the last couple of years, those ministries have thrived under her leadership. And the way that Angie would tell you if she was here today is that for 15 years, as she worked in the business world, that God gave her the tools and the skills to be able to do this job. And for the last 7 years, God has taught her what it means to be dependent upon Him. And taking both of those skills together, Angie moves into this role as someone who is highly qualified and also incredibly faithful to the God that we serve. And so I am super pumped and grateful that Angie said yes and that she's stepping into that role. I know another question that you may be asking is, if something happens to me, does Angie become the senior pastor? And so the way that I would answer that is no. Constitutionally, a man has to be the senior pastor here at Crossroads Church, and my named successor is Chris Amdahl. And if there was anything that was to happen to me, Pastor Chris would step up into an interim role and lead this church. That if anything happened to me, that we are set up for success in the future, where Pastor Chris would lead from a pastoral leadership, and Angie would run the organization of the church, making sure the vision and the execution of that vision was still happening. And Pastor Chris would serve in that role of pastoral leadership until church council decided what they wanted to do in order to find the next person to lead this church forward as its senior pastor. And so Angie is uniquely qualified to be the executive here at Crossroads Church and to serve in that role, and is excited to be in that role. Now, last thing, you might be wondering where Angie is at. Angie was supposed to be a part of this today and actually sitting in the seat that Jeff is right now. But for Angie, her stepdad is in the last days of his life, and she is with him right now, talking about end-of-life decisions that they need to make. His lung is collapsing. He happens to be on the COVID hall. He doesn't have COVID, but that's where they've put him. And so Angie has also been exposed in low levels to COVID. And so for the next week or two, she'll be in quarantine and with her family as they go through that time as a family. So kind of quickly here, moving through the rest of this, that when it comes under Angie, you have operations. I asked Pastor Bruce to oversee our operations, that he is a guy who gets things done. And when it comes to communication and finances and administration and HR and legal stuff, Bruce is the guy that I trust more than anyone to get those things done, all right? And so he'll oversee that. You can see the staff that's under him. Moving over to what we call the directional team. We have outreach, and I've asked Pastor Trevor to move out of his role as campus pastor and into his role as really pastor of outreach, where he'll oversee Go Serve and missions, living in 4D, events of outreach into this community. That's his role. That when you think of the goals, think of 5,000 people being impacted by us living in 4D. That's Trevor's role. Next up, you see innovation. That's really our digital space. And Jared will serve as the pastor of innovation, leading our digital, our social media, our online oversight of website, creative media, all of that stuff that God has gifted in him, and that he's driving that bus to engage 10,000 people digitally. When it comes to weekend services, Pastor Tim is our pastor of production services, and he oversees all the things that you experience on the weekend, from teaching to tech to music to hospitality to the content that we put out in terms of life groups and so on and so forth. That is all Tim. And ultimately, when it comes to the vision, that 1,500 people being baptized falls under Pastor Tim's purview. And so that's where Pastor Tim lands. That with Pastor James, we're moving him out of the Northglenn campus pastors. Remember, there's no more campus pastors. We're one church, multiple venues. And James becomes the pastor of engagement. That when you think of everyone being involved in a discipleship path and being discipled, that falls under James's purview. And so when it comes to that, that's connections. That's Kristen Brown. groups with Tiffany Dunn, all of our family ministry, which includes our children's and our youth, as well as men and women's, all of that falls under Engage. That if you are looking to be discipled or that discipleship path here at Crossroads Church, Pastor James is the guy overseeing that. And then finally, what we have is Care. That Care is a core ministry of any church, that we want to be a church that cares for people well, and that falls under Chris Amdahl, that he is uniquely gifted in terms of his care. We've seen that over the last 5 years, and so he'll oversee our counseling center, as well as pastoral counseling, funeral care, Stephen ministry, benevolence, prayer, all of those things that are care related fall under Pastor Chris. Now, final thing there is when it comes to our residency program, Pastor Kim is running that for us under Pastor Bruce, overseeing really the residents, and our hope is to have 10 to 15 residents over the next 5 years, living that out, and then, like I said earlier, seeing them take on their own churches and planting and starting new churches here at Crossroads Church. And so, I know that was like a fire hydrant, 40 minutes of explanation, but I wanted to lay it all out there for you. And so hopefully Pastor James has maybe passed on a few questions to us.
Not yet, but we do have the
not
delay.
Yet.
So I think we should put out there that, we welcome questions, and there will be that delay. Give us some time to come back and answer those as we kind of move along here and try to catch up.
Yeah, try to catch up. All right. So as the fire hydrant, if you have questions, go ahead and ask them. Once the 2-minute delay catches up, we'll take some time. We'll pause here to answer any questions that you might have in terms of our strategic process, where we've been, where we're going. All the way that this is going to be laid out is on August 16th. I'm going to take the opportunity to share what I just shared with you in a sermon and laying this out for our entire church so that we can engage this and start moving forward in this. I'm super excited for the way that God's working and incredibly grateful for the last 7-8 months, as hard as they've been at times, to walk through this process together with our staff and with our consultants, putting this together to be able to share it with you. All right? So, as all of that kind of catches up with us, we'll move on to 2 of the big voting issues that we have. And so first, I want to talk a little bit about the budget, and then I'll let Jeff share. When it comes to the budget, as we have lived out this COVID-19 season, one of the things that I'm incredibly grateful for is that, unlike many churches, we have not seen a huge drop-off in financial giving. However, everything that we're reading is preparing us to see these next really 18 months, and particularly the fall, as really trying times. That as the economy struggles to get back up and running and recover, the reality is that the stuff that we're going to face is we're going to, at some point, eventually feel the economic impact of COVID-19 as a church. And so under the leadership of our church council and under the leadership of our trustees, we've decided to do 2 things. The first is that we've decided to do a 6-month budget. So from July to December, we'll operate on a budget, and the reason that we're doing that is to maintain flexibility, so that if we have to make decisions in November, December, that we have the ability to do that without rewriting or rewriting the budget that we had already voted on. And so come December or early January, we'll vote on another 6-month budget just so that we can maintain flexibility. The other decision that we've made is to cut our budget by 15%. And so last year, our total budget was $3 million, and we've cut that by 15%. And so this year, we're rolling into this year with a $2.7 million budget. So we've cut $300,000 out of that. We've put aside another $100,000 or so as emergency funds just in case. And so really, we're operating on a $2.6 million budget, just as, again, foreseeing what's going to happen economically and wanting to be in the best shape that we can over these next 6 months, and then evaluating where we are going. And so what you have, or what you'll see when you click the link to take you to the vote, is that you can check out our budget, and you can see how we reorganized what we spent last year, the cuts that we made this year, as we move forward through this season and navigating the best that we can the impact of COVID-19. And so if you have any questions, you can go ahead and ask those questions online. Not Pastor, but Chip, our CFO, is online. He can help answer those questions. I'll also be paying attention if any questions come up about the budget. The other thing that we're going to vote on today is for Jeff Tompkins.
We do have some questions.
We do?
So whenever
Okay.
you want to make a little segue,
All right,
do that.
let's let me go ahead and have you do it, and then we'll just answer all the questions at
Okay.
the end. Like what do they call that food? I don't really like it, but where you just throw everything together. Have you ever had it? It's a Scandinavian dish.
Oh, smorgasbord?
Yeah, smorgasbord. Yeah, we'll just make it a smorgasbord at the end of question. Ooh, goulash. Yeah, that's the one actually I was thinking
That's
of.
what I call whenever my wife's out of town. I mean, that's pretty much
it's goulash?
It's whatever's in the fridge.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I hate goulash. So anyways, that's how we'll do questions at the end. So the other thing that we need to vote on is our next moderator here at Crossroads Church. Typically, this is done in January. And if you've been a regular part of this business meeting, then you'll know that Gavin McKelvey has been our moderator at Crossroads Church. And a moderator is just our top lay leader, that they have a foot both in the staffing world and in the lay leadership world, or the lay world of church. And they walk this path of really moderating the church and being a voice for the congregation among the staff, also as the president of our church council. And so Jeff would be that person if he's voted in today. Now, Gavin has been that and has served that actually twice here at Crossroads Church. The first time he led us through the rewriting of our Constitution. The second time he led us through the transition that I have nothing but great affection for Gavin and his leadership at Crossroads Church and his friendship to me. Unfortunately, because of the COVID-19 situation, that his job called him to move from Colorado to Houston, Texas. I'm sure that Pastor Kim has a few thoughts in terms of what he believes about Texas. And so, anyways, Gavin and his wife Melissa and their kids moved to Texas in the beginning of June, leaving a hole within our leadership team and within our church of moderator. And so the church council got together and nominated Jeff Tompkins, who serves on our church council, to be the next moderator at Crossroads Church for really the next 3.5 years. I don't know if you signed up for knew that, but 3.5 years. So, so anyways, that's what Jeff is stepping into. And so with Jeff here today, if you would, just go ahead and share a little bit about who you are and, your family, so on and so forth.
Yeah, if Kim doesn't like that Gavin and family moved to Houston. I'm from Houston, so it's even worse, I guess, but I have no intention of moving back. It's like 120 degrees there right now. So as Matt said earlier, I'm one of those people, myself, my wife Michelle, and our daughter Lily, that came from another church. We were at a church called Colorado Ridge that had been founded, probably 20-something years ago. And it is a church that shut down, went through some difficult times, some pastoral change. And they used a little different system. They went with what they call kind of the elder system, and I was chair of the elders there twice, served 2 terms kind of like Gavin, and we had been there, I probably put it on my bio, and now I'm not even going to remember exactly what it was. I think around 13 years. And finally, towards the end of it, decided God had really said it was time to move on. Like you said, we had people that we knew that went to Crossroads and said, hey, you ought to come to Crossroads. You'd love Crossroads. Yeah. So
you actually served as like the executive pastor, as a lay leader at that church during some of their struggling years, right?
Yeah, between a pastor leaving and finding an interim, I acted as kind of a volunteer executive pastor. Yeah. You're fine, Chip. I'm not coming for your job. And it was a blast. I held staff meetings, met with staff, hired, fired, raises, all that fun stuff. So,
Wow, that's cool. So tell us a little bit about your family.
So Michelle and I have been married for going on 18 years around this Thanksgiving, beginning of November. My daughter Lily is 12, involved in the youth group, absolutely loves our youth group. She disappears on Wednesdays, and at some point we get her again. But she absolutely loves, especially in COVID, being able to see kids. This last Wednesday, they got to go see everybody at the Green's house, and absolutely loved it. So, and we'll see. She's entering 7th grade. We'll see what that means. We don't know yet from Adam's 12, but we're hoping it's going to be good. So, yeah.
And you've served on a variety of roles in terms of leadership here at Crossroads, and so not only church council this year, but before that.
Yeah, men's ministry. I've been in the leadership team here. I've also I've led a men's group for a number of years, both at our previous church and now currently lead a group. We started a new one through a seminar series that we did at North Glen 2 years ago. And then I took over, actually, the McKelveys leaving the position with him as moderator. They were hosting our group. We actually met the McKelveys through Rooted, and we're in their Rooted group. and have now started to lead that. So,
yeah. Well, very cool.
Fun. Yeah.
That'll be fun. All right, so that's a little bit about Jeff. And so if you have any questions about Jeff, he would certainly be happy to answer those, or what does moderator look like, or anything. Yeah. So we'll just open it up to any questions that you have. And as you ask the questions, we'll be watching this. And so, Jeff, you can pay attention there. And then Michelle also has emailed me a few questions from the chat room. And so I'll answer a few of these. Sure. And then, Jeff, you can kind of pay attention as other questions come in. And so one of the questions says that adding 2 church plants, does that make us a 5-campus church? The answer to that is no, that the churches that we want to plant and to launch are really churches that we see as self-sufficient, that our goal within the residency program would be to come along, maybe a struggling church or a church that's dying and needs to be revived, and to put a resident in that space, to train in that space, and then ultimately to get that church to a place of sustainability and launch that church as its own campus, as its own, not own campus, as its own church. And so when it comes to planting 2 churches that make us 5 campus, no, we are really content being 3, all right? And not so much campus, but again, start to think of venues. And so the second question then is, has this structure been developed in consultation and recommendation of the consultants? Absolutely. So over the course of our consulting process, we met with the consultants 3 times in terms of 2-day retreats, and then every month I'm on a coaching call with one of them in terms of just engaging in this process and growing as a senior pastor here at Crossroads Church. And so one of the retreats that we had in April, well, let me back up. In March, we sat down and we did a whole ton of strategic planning. And so this is where we talk through our core beliefs and our mission and what is a disciple. It's where we spent a lot of time in terms of prayer and what is the church called to, in order that we came out with the vision that I presented to you. We spent a lot of time going, if this was our vision, what do these goals look like? And then ultimately, how do we put the strategies in place to achieve these goals? That was all in March. We spent 2 days, and then about 4 weeks afterwards, really developing that. In the midst of all of this COVID craziness, our staff was working on those things. And then what happened is in April, we took all of that stuff that we had developed, and we met with a guy named Lance Witt, who was part of Saddleback Church, an executive pastor at Saddleback under Rick Warren. He came for 2 days. He lives down in Castle Rock, and he came alongside us. And he said, now in light of everything that you've done at your strategic planning process, let's put together a plan of reorganizing the staff in a way to meet these goals. And so everything that I presented to you was worked with them. Over a 2-day period, we reorganized all of the staff, and then the 2-3 weeks after that, Angie and I specifically went through and really prayed through and organized people into the spaces and said, is this where God's calling? And then we had meetings with all of our staff, some individually, some within groups, to walk through what it is and how it is that we were going to reorganize the staffing around meeting the vision and living out the mission of Crossroads Church. And so Lance Witt has actually kind of come alongside Angie in some very cool ways. And so as she steps into this executive role, Lance is walking right there with her in that. Some of our other consultants are walking with me as we live this out together. Another question that's come in is, what will happen to the campus pastors? Is that going to be shared role amongst the pastors? Yes. So the quick answer to that is yes. So campus pastors are no longer campus pastors. So James, Trevor, and Jared have been moved into new roles. And when it comes to the campuses, what we're approaching is very much kind of a shared pastoral space. And so in any weekend that you will see James at a number of our campuses, at Fort Lupton specifically, we're going to use that as our intern space. And so that's where Alex Statler, our resident, is going to be stationed up there providing pastoral care along his training. And so when it comes to everything from care to engagement to worship, the pastors are really taking a shared load as we live out that together. Let's see here. Here's a question. Did you see that one? Can I read that one? Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm gonna read that with the snarkiness I think is intended, because I think that's Stu Jackson.
Okay.
With Jeff Tompkins being possibly elevated to the moderator position, does that mean a position opens on the church council? If so, what is the process to fill that spot? And this is where video just is not the same as having people.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. So, yes, so there is a hole at church council now. What we try to do, or constitutionally, what we're called to do is to have one more lay leader than we have staff. And so we have 6 staff people on, 6 lay leaders, and then the moderator. And so if it ever came to a vote, the senior pastor could not swing it with staff. That's the way church council is set up, the way it is. Now with Gavin leaving and Jeff now moving into that role as moderator, we do indeed have a hole at our church council on the lay side of things. And actually, we're talking to Loretta Dudley has already taken a volunteer position to lead our prayer ministry. If you don't know Loretta, she is an amazing prayer warrior here at Crossroads Church, and Pastor Chris has asked her to come alongside and to be in that space. And so, pretty quickly, we're actually going to be down 2 lay leaders. And so, right now, we're going through the process of praying through and looking for who is going to fill those spots. And so, if you're one of the people that comes to mind, then you'll be contacted. In fact, the moderator position is a big position because the moderator is actually the one who brings to the church council a group of people to nominate for the position. Then it's vetted, then we ask the people. And so that's the quick process, is that Jeff and I will work together and go, who are some of the lay leaders that we would ask to serve in this space? And then Jeff would begin to have those conversations. We would bring that list to church council. If there was nothing going on there, then we would start to make those offers. Right now, so that you don't worry, is that we actually have the head of our trustees, Rick Green, serving in a little bit of a role in church council where he's a part of that. And so where he's not an official member of church council, he has a very large voice in church council right now, and so he balances out a little bit of the disparity. But hopefully by October, we'll have 2 names to bring to the congregation to vote on as we move forward with this.
All right.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so I'm going to put out there, Jim B., I'm not sure if I understand what your question is. If you maybe could rewrite that. I'm going to skip on to Chip's, and I believe this is a different Chip. What plans are being made regarding our brick and mortar facilities?
Yeah.
Our 3 buildings.
Yes, this is probably Chip Holton.
Okay.
So thank you, Chip, for asking that question. When it comes to our brick and mortar facilities, right now, actually August 5th is a big day. Church Council is getting together, and one of the things that we're talking about is how do we move forward with our buildings. The reality is, in this COVID season, with the restrictions that are being put on us by the government, and probably rightfully so, that we want to care for our community, we want to do what's being asked of us from our health professionals. When it comes to our buildings, how do we do them? And so right now, they're shut down, and we are being very what's the word that I'm looking for? That we're being good stewards of how to use the buildings, making sure that they're costing us the minimal amount that we can at this point. Going forward, of what does it look like in the fall, that'll be for church council to decide on August 5th. And just to be honest with you, in some of the conversations that I've been with in pastor calls with governors, so on and so forth, is that my guess is the state that we're living in right now will probably continue into the fall. And so we're going to have to figure out what that looks like. The rules are pretty complicated. The guidelines are complicated in terms of buildings. And so we're navigating that. So what I can tell you right now is that currently we have a social distance calculator that's put out by the state that tells us how many people we can have in a room. And so we're going through measuring all of our rooms to figure out how many people can be in each room so that we can make decisions based on that. And then what is the cost of opening buildings for the limited amount of people that we can have. And so we're going to bring all that information to church council and make those decisions starting in August on that newsletter that week, August 6th, or maybe the next week. We'll get that information to the congregation so that you can plan for the fall. Right now, outdoor services are going well. We continue to reach many, many people. Online services. In fact, our online attendance it continues to be amazing to me. And so God's still moving even without the use of our buildings. But man, we would love to use these facilities. We're just praying that God opens the door.
Yeah. All right. Let me see if actually I can And Jim, I apologize if this misses your point, but really the question of what effectively, if you're going to 3 locations instead of 3 separate campuses, we're going away from campus pastors, what will effectively unite those into one church? Kind of a big question, but
yes.
I think that's kind of what he's getting to with his question on the chat.
Yeah, so the uniting of the one church at multiple venues is really seeing that all of our ministries are coming under like one space, right? So when it comes to children's ministry, I mentioned that earlier, and Pastor James, that Pastor James is over engagement. He's working with our family ministry. And when it comes specifically to our children's ministry, no longer are our children's ministry divided up into campuses, but rather they're working together as one team, asking the question, what does it look like to provide children's ministry across all 3 of our venues? And so what is experienced at Northglenn is also experienced at Thornton and also at Fort Lupton. And so regardless of what campus you're at or venue that you're at, that you will be getting the same thing across all of our campuses. Ultimately, whether it's multi-site or multiple venues, one location, the thing that overwhelmingly unites people is the sermon and the vision of the church. And so as we move into that space, that's really the uniting factor as we move forward. I had another question just pop up here
go for it.
From Michelle. It says, what are Pastor Kim's thoughts on the changes being proposed? Well, let me just say that he hates them, but he's no longer in charge. No, I'm just kidding. So, as we've went through all of this, Pastor Kim and I continue to meet every other week. We get together and have lunch together and talk through. And so Pastor Kim has been purview to all of the things being discussed, and has seen all of them, and I've asked him his opinion and to get his input on all of this. And the thing that he continues to speak about is how excited he is for the vision of this church, where we're leading him. He reminds me always that in 2015, when we came up with the transition plan, that we had no idea what would happen in 2020, and that only God knew, and that God knew that I was the right leader for this time, that he could never do it. And I just look at him and I just say, that's just because you would never want to lead through this, because nobody would. But anyways, Pastor Kim has been incredibly encouraging through this entire process. He's up to speed with all of that. He's excited for what we're doing, and if he's on the chat room, he can go ahead and pipe up.
So he's very offended.
Yeah. So that's where Pastor Kim is. If not, you can email him and ask him yourself, kim.scadam@crossroadsabc.com, and he can give you an answer for himself. Any other questions? Well, maybe as the questions come in, Tim, if we can go ahead and put the slide, we'll go ahead and move, since it's 4 o'clock, to voting. Jeff and I will continue to answer some questions and hang out here for the next 15 minutes or so, but we're ready to vote and take a roll call. And so there's a link given in the chat room. Will be given here. And so Michelle and James will put that up, or you can go to crossroadsabc.com/vote. And when you get there, a couple of things. One is you can put in your name, and then there will be boxes there for you to check to vote yes or no. And with each of those yes or no votes, there's a link there that you can click. So you can see all of the slides that we just you can see Jeff's bio, or you can see the slide that has the budget information on there. So you can take a look at that before you vote on it. You're not voting on the vision or any of that kind of stuff, but just Jeff, the minutes from last time, and the budget for the next 6 months. So you can go ahead and vote there. Now, one other thing for you, if there's 2 people in your house and both of you are members, one person at a time. So one person pull it up, fill out all the information, cast your vote, and then pull up that link again, change the information, the name, however you want to vote, and then submit it a second time. That way that we can get both of you counted as we move through that. And so we'll keep that slide up there. We'll watch the chat room. If any questions come in, we'll go ahead and answer them. All right, Tim, we have a few questions here that are coming in. So if you want to put us back on camera, I'll answer these questions. So one of the questions that have come up is, what type of infrastructure of parking,
i.e. parking,
i.e. parking, is being looked at as we increase in size? Right now, a lot of that is actually on hold. So we hope to grow. but we also realize that the current season that we're in, what does that look like? And so what we are preparing for as a church is that a majority of our growth will actually be online in this season. And as we come back together, our hope is that when we open the doors, that people flood into the buildings. However, what has shown itself to be true so far is that churches who have never closed, or churches that are ahead of us in terms of opening their buildings, some of them weeks or even months ahead of us, that most churches are seeing attendance in the 10 to 25% pre-COVID. So a church our size of 1,500 currently, before COVID hit, that we would likely see somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 to 450 people come to our services if we were to open the building, which dramatically changes the way that we think about our buildings and the way that we move. And so time will tell what infrastructure that we need to do in order to meet the needs of a growing congregation, but we would look at all things. So we would look at certainly parking lot and building space. Before that, we would actually look at adding more services. What would it look like to not just have a 9:30 and 11 service, but possibly a 9:30, 11, and 1, or even a 6 o'clock service, whatever that might look like. And so as we grow, we'll look towards all of that thing, particularly engaging online as well.
I think that would be next. So from Gene.
All right. So when we return to physical church, will there be a traditional worship service? So that is a good question. Right now, that is probably up in the air as we move towards this. I don't know one way or another, because many people have actually told us that they might not be returning to church in terms of this COVID thing. And so a lot of this is up in the air as we navigate this. I don't know what church is going to look like in 3 months from now, 6 months to now, but we're preparing for this COVID season to be a long season. And so whether we have tradition services or contemporary services, what time our services are, how we're doing services, all of that is completely up in the air right now. We're just navigating 1 week at a time, doing what we can do. Maybe part of this question is you may have noticed that we haven't had a traditional service during COVID, and part of that is in terms of resources that we have and the amount of time that we want people to be together. So each service that we put together for online is about 6 hours worth of work for staff and volunteers. That's about how much time we spend putting together a service. And so to add another service like Traditions would be another 6 hours where we would have people together. And we just thought, in terms of wisdom at this point, let's focus on one service, do it really well during this season, and then as things unfold, we'll figure out everything else. So I don't know if that satisfies the question, but it's all up in the air, and we'll move forward with it the best that we can.
So the next question from Stu, question regarding the reorg. Are there designated evaluation periods to judge the effectiveness of the changes, i.e. 3 months, 6 months? You talked a little bit about the 90-day sprints, which I think is where that entails. Maybe you give a little more detail on kind of how that's going to look.
Yeah, so part of this is regular evaluations, and so what we're putting in place is really an evaluation system that isn't just like a once-a-year annual review. Those have been shown in the business world and in the church world not to be highly effective, but rather to monitor it basically quarters at a time or within these 90-day sprints. And so there's high accountability. We've entered into some project management, and this is where Angie's background becomes amazing for us, of really looking at a particular area and looking at it and going, what needs to be accomplished in these next 90 days to move us forward, so that there's accountability, so that there's progress being made, so on and so forth. And so really that's the way that we're driving, with regular reviews intermittently through that, to talk about goals, to talk about performance, so on and so forth as we move forward. And so we're putting a lot of that structure in place that hasn't necessarily been there before. We're working on putting all of that structure in place. And so right now, when you look at that directional team of outreach, innovation, weekend services, engagement, and care, all of them are running their own 90-day sprints with ideas and understandings of what is it that we're accomplishing and trying to do in these 90 days to be successful as we move forward. So just to give you an example, the digital ministry is fairly new, And even though we've kind of had our hand in it, it's never been really a driver of the church. And so one of Jared's first roles in these 90 days is really to come up with goals of what does each platform really do. Why are we on Facebook? Why are we on Instagram? What role does YouTube play in the greater context of church when it comes to teaching, when it comes to engagement, so on and so forth. And so he's building the why. Are we on the platforms? And then as he's building the why, he's building out infrastructure of going, how do we need to staff that, first with volunteers, and then hopefully at some point with paid staff, but into those places to support the why that we do that, to have the infrastructure, and then in these 90 days to begin to build a team to fill out that infrastructure. And so over these 90 days, by the time the end of September gets here, our goal for Jared in terms of innovation would to be understand the why, to have the infrastructure built for innovation, and then to have volunteers starting to fill those positions as we make that progress. And so that's just part of his 90-day sprint that he's on right now. So hopefully that speaks to that question.
Okay. And you actually started to dive into the next question a little bit about what types of items are in the innovation section of the budget and the engagement. Chip answered some of that in terms of innovations, equipment such as cameras, microphones, some subscriptions for some of the things we do. How about maybe on the engagement side as well?
Yeah, so innovation, Jeff just covered it. Part of the budget for innovation is we've never done it before. Yeah. And so it's like developing a ministry from scratch. So what is it that we need to do digital ministry well? So that's the budget that we've wanted to start, at least for Jared, in terms of that. When it comes to engagement, the engagement are things that are typical of a church. So when you think of connection or assimilation, so when someone new comes, how do we connect them to Crossroads Church? We wanted to make sure that there was budget to engage that and to move that forward. When it comes to community groups, Tiffany has a budget so that she can take care of community group leaders and engage them and get them the resources that they need. When it comes to family ministry, that's youth and children. And so all of our youth and children's budgets have been moved to under Engage, so that when it comes to engaging kids and students, really the next generation, that we are putting money towards that because we believe that's an essential part of engaging families. And so that's where the engagement budget looks like. That's what's going on there. A lot of it is money that was from the past of things moved into the future. Now we're reimagining what those can look like in terms of the budget, but they have budget dollars to live this out and to do youth ministry, to do children's, to do connection, to do group life, really to fund the discipleship path that we want every single person to be on.
Great. And both James and Chip talked about that a little bit. So a question on the latest thoughts about the development of the land at Thornton campus. You answered that a little bit. I mean, right now, it's not a good use of our money in the COVID environment to be developing land and plan for that, because one, we don't know how long we're going to be not in here. Right. we're still kind of up in the air, but maybe you can give a little more thought on that. I know you talked about it a little bit.
Yeah.
Just where we're at.
Yeah, when it comes to the land, we've basically hit the pause button on the land. Like Jeff said, at this point, we have a lot of other plates spinning in terms of just how to navigate this season. Like I said, all of church changed overnight. Everything that we knew about church in January has completely shifted and changed about how we do church. And so we've spent our time going, what does it look like to engage people who can not actually be in the building, that we can't actually see face to face? How do you care for people who you're not allowed to see? What does hospital visits look like when you're not actually allowed to go to the hospital? So on and so forth. And so all of those specific things, we've moved our attention to that, and the land we've just kind of hit the pause button on. And it doesn't mean that it's dead or that we're not going to do it, but particularly in this season, church council saw it as a tough spot to go, we're going to continue to move in that direction, pour resource in that direction, when we need to start planning for a possible economic struggle in the next couple of months and even next couple of years. And so just simply have hit the pause button at Thornton campus right now.
I do not see any more questions. I did want to address one comment I saw. So there was, from a Mary on there, her comment was, my head hurts from there's so much change.
Yeah.
And I want to say, I totally get that. I mean, we're in an hour-long online conversation, and talking about things that some churches never do in 100 years. I mean, we're talking about a lot in a small time frame. I think you have to know that your senior pastor, your staff, your church council, your trustees, leadership, people that have been kind of going through this process with the staff, is bought in. We're excited. And that doesn't mean that it's not going to be hard. Change is always going to be tough, especially when you lump on COVID. Yeah. We've got a lot of things, just a lot of challenges, but that doesn't mean that it's not something that we're looking forward to taking on. I mean, I think I can only speak for myself, but I'm excited for when we go through the big pieces of what this means for Crossroads. It's I think it's exciting because I think it's the mission God's calling us to. And I think in some ways, the church, we're waking up to that. We're waking up to, hey, this is what I want to do. This is what I want my church to be, and go do it. Yeah,
yeah, that's exactly it. I think that I was talking to Pastor Tim earlier, and he put it just in pretty good terms. There is a lot of change. There's a lot that's happening. And yet the reality is that the world's changing all around us, and churches who refuse to change, refuse to embrace what's happening are going to die. We're part of a region where already more than a handful of churches have closed their doors because they were not ready or willing to change with what's happening in our culture right now. And so we can either be one of those churches and watch ourselves and go into a slow death, or maybe a quick death, as COVID's proving to be for churches, or we can look at this and go, God, what are you calling us to? How can we change to prepare ourselves for the future, to be here in the future, to be able to bring the gospel in the future? And that this is what this is all about. That very early on in COVID, we had a conversation both with our core team and with church council. And the question was, should we continue with the strategic process planning, or should we hit a pause button and just navigate COVID? And every single person said we need to press on when it comes to the strategic plan, because ultimately everything's going to change. And better to go through this now, preparing for the future, than to just navigate this with an unknown where God's calling us. And so I'm incredibly grateful for where God's led us in this, and at the same time, it is a lot of change, but there's not really any other option at this point. Michelle sent me a text, do we need to make a motion? And I don't know how to do a motion online. And so you and I are both a part of the membership. And so I'm going to make the motion, and if you give it a second, then both of us can say aye, and we can go ahead and vote, because I don't know what else it looks like. So I make a motion to make the vote.
And I will second that.
Great. And all in favor say aye. 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 All right. So there's your motion, and
Smallest
I guess your approval. I don't know how else to do it. So we'll just consider that real.
I think, so a couple more questions. Chip did say we can forego Robert's Rules of Order, so we just did that for nothing. But that's all right.
Good. All right.
No, from Don and Kathy, when we can have church again in the buildings, will all the teaching be at one location, or will there be a rotation in place?
Yeah.
I don't know if we know.
Yeah, we don't. We don't know. Right now, we're just trying to get through what we have. When we open the buildings again, what does it look like? So let's just play this out. If only 300 people are willing to come back, and we have another 1,700 people online, what does that look like for Crossroads Church? Does it make sense for us to have 3 campuses open if we're only serving 300 people in the building in any given time? And so the answer to that is I don't know right now. I'm not willing to make a commitment one way or another. What we're doing right now is we're set up here at Thornton campus to do what we're doing really well, thanks to Pastor Tim and Jared alongside him. And so that's where we're at right now. That's how I'd answer the question.
Yeah. I think Chip answered JLG's question. James answered Andy's question. I mean, we can certainly take more. I'm not seeing any.
Okay. Well, at this point, maybe we'll just call this good for right now. And you and I can just hang out for 12 minutes.
Yep.
And if anything else pops up, we'll let people know.
And I think I think the whole congregation knows, obviously, the staff is obviously been going through this. They're available for questions. I would say the church council is always available. The trustees are, they're part of our community. They're all available for those questions. If there's something that comes up on the budget, if there's things you don't understand, that's what we're here for. Crossroads keeps an open book and is transparent. That's why, I agreed to do this. So.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. So I think that's about everything. So maybe Tim just cues some cool music, and then Jeff and I will pay attention to the chats. I'll jump on the chat, and if there's any questions I can answer, I'll answer there. Otherwise, we have 10, 11 minutes left here, and we'll go from there. Thanks for joining us today.